May 28, 2012, Sofia, Bulgaria. Whitney Houston walked into the Armeets Arena for what would unknowingly be her final performance. In 257 days, the greatest voice of all time would be silenced forever. The backstage area buzzed with nervous energy as 8,000 devoted fans filed into their seats. Many had traveled thousands of miles across Eastern Europe just to witness history. They came expecting to see Whitney Houston, the voice, America's sweetheart. Instead, they were about to witness the most heartbreaking goodbye in music history. Whitney stood in front of her dressing room mirror, her hands trembling as she applied lipstick. At 48 years old, she was a ghost of the powerhouse who had dominated the world 20 years earlier. The woman who had once effortlessly hit notes that made angels weep now struggled to speak without her voice cracking. But what slowly for months. Her assistant, Patricia, watched helplessly from the doorway. Over the past year, she had witnessed Whitney's devastating transformation. The woman who had once commanded stadiums with supernatural confidence now needed help just to prepare for a simple sound check. "Whitney, maybe we should cancel tonight," Patricia whispered, her voice thick with concern. "Your voice during rehearsal." It wasn't. Whitney's reflection stared back at her from the mirror. Those eyes that had once sparkled with unshakable confidence now held something Patricia had never seen before: fear. "These people came to see Whitney Houston," Whitney replied, but as she spoke, her voice cracked on the word Houston. The irony cut through the air like a blade. "That's what they're going to get." The truth was, Whitney Houston's voice had been systematically destroying itself for over 3 years. The damage hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of decades of pressure, of pushing her instrument beyond human limits, of trying to maintain an impossible standard of perfection. Every high note in "I Will Always Love You" had cost her. Every soaring melody had taken a piece of her vocal cords. Every standing ovation had demanded more than she had to give. Dr. Stephen Zeitels, the throat specialist who had been treating Whitney privately, had delivered devastating news just weeks earlier. The vocal cord damage was irreversible. The muscle tension in her throat had become chronic. Her larynx was inflamed permanently. What the world didn't know was that Whitney Houston had already lost the ability to sing, but she was still trying. Outside her dressing room, the European tour had been a nightmare. Concert after concert had ended in vocal failure. In Amsterdam, she had walked off stage after just 3 songs. In Birmingham, her voice had given out completely during "I Wanna Dance with Somebody." Music critics across Europe were calling it painful to watch and the tragic end of a legend. Tonight in Sofia would be different. Tonight would be worse. The Bulgarian fans had no idea what they were about to witness. Social media was buzzing with excitement. #Whitney in Sofia was trending across Eastern Europe. Videos of fans arriving at the arena showed people crying with joy just at the thought of seeing their idol. "I've waited 20 years for this moment," one fan told a local news camera. "Whitney Houston saved my life with her music. Tonight I get to thank her." If only she had known she was about to watch Whitney die. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, had flown to Europe specifically for this tour. He had worked with Whitney for 7 years, through her comeback attempt, through her rehabilitation, through countless hours of trying to rebuild what had been broken. As he listened to Whitney warm up that evening, his heart sank. "She has maybe 30 minutes of usable voice left," he confided to Patricia. "After that, there's nothing. Her vocal cords are like broken rubber bands. They can't stretch anymore." The irony was crushing. Whitney Houston, the woman who had redefined what the human voice could achieve, was now physically unable to sing. But 8,000 people had paid their hard-earned money to see a legend, and Whitney was determined to give them something, even if it killed what was left of her voice. At 8:47 p.m., the arena lights dimmed, and Whitney Houston stepped toward her final moment of glory. The opening acts had finished. The anticipation in the arena was electric. Fans held homemade signs reading "Whitney, we love you" in Bulgarian, English, and Russian. Many were crying before the show even started, overwhelmed by the emotion of finally seeing their musical goddess. When Whitney's silhouette appeared behind the curtain, the roar was deafening. 20 years of pent-up love and admiration erupted in a single explosion of sound that shook the building's foundations. For a moment it felt like 1992 again, when Whitney was untouchable, unstoppable, and seemingly immortal. But when the spotlight hit Whitney Houston, 8,000 hearts simultaneously broke. She looked fragile under the harsh stage lights. The flowing gown that should have made her appear regal instead made her seem small and lost. Her once commanding presence had been replaced by something that made every person in the front rows lean forward in concern. Whitney approached the microphone with hesitant steps. The confidence that had once made her seem larger than life was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew they were walking on broken glass. "Hello, Sofia," she called out to the crowd. The sound that came from her mouth made 8,000 people gasp in horror. Her voice was hoarse, thin, barely recognizable as the instrument that had moved a generation. Where there should have been power, there was only a raspy whisper. Where there should have been Whitney Houston, there was only the echo of what she used to be. But the crowd cheered anyway. They cheered louder than they had for any other performer in the arena's history, because they understood what they were witnessing wasn't a concert, it was a goodbye. Whitney launched into "I Wanna Dance with Somebody," the song that had defined the euphoric peak of her career, the song that represented everything joyful and unstoppable about Whitney Houston in her prime. Within 10 seconds, everyone in the arena knew something was catastrophically wrong. Whitney's voice cracked on the very first line. Not a small crack, not a subtle imperfection, but a complete breakdown of everything that had made her famous. The backup singers immediately sang louder, trying desperately to cover for their icon, but there was no hiding what was happening. In the VIP section, music journalists sat frozen. They had come expecting to write reviews about nostalgia and legacy. Instead, they were documenting the public execution of everything Whitney Houston had ever been. But something extraordinary happened in that moment. Instead of walking away, instead of demanding their money back, the 8,000 people in that arena did something that would haunt Whitney for the rest of her life. They began singing with her. At first, it was just a few voices in the front rows, then a section, then half the arena. Soon, all 8,000 people were singing "I Wanna Dance with Somebody" while Whitney Houston stood at the microphone, tears streaming down her face, listening to her own song being performed by the people who loved her. She stopped singing completely. For a full minute, she just stood there, overwhelmed by the sound of thousands of voices carrying the melody that her broken instrument could no longer handle. "Thank you," she whispered into the microphone, her voice breaking with emotion rather than vocal damage for the first time that night. The crowd responded with a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. They weren't applauding her performance. They were applauding her for trying, for showing up, for still being there when everyone else might have given up. But Whitney wasn't done destroying herself yet. She attempted "How Will I Know?", another song from her golden era. The results were even more devastating. The high notes that had once come as naturally as breathing were now impossible mountains she could no longer climb. Her voice wavered, cracked, and finally gave out completely during the chorus. Dr. Zeitels, watching from the wings, later said it was the most heartbreaking thing he had ever witnessed in 30 years of treating vocal injuries. She was trying to sing with vocal cords that were essentially paralyzed. He revealed years later, it was like watching someone try to run with broken legs. The spirit was there, but the body had given up. Whitney attempted to continue, but her voice was disappearing before the arena's eyes. By the third song, she could barely speak, let alone sing. Her breathing became labored. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool arena air. Then she made a decision that would define how 8,000 people remembered her forever. Instead of walking off stage in defeat, Whitney sat down at the edge of the performance platform, abandoning all pretense of a polished show. "I'm not the singer I used to be," she told the crowd with brutal honesty. Her voice was barely audible, but the arena's sound system carried every heartbreaking word. But I'm still here, and you're still here, and maybe that's what matters. The arena fell into complete silence. This wasn't the choreographed perfection they had expected from a global superstar. This was raw, honest, and more beautiful than any technically perfect performance could have been. For the next 18 minutes, Whitney Houston gave the most important performance of her career. She talked to the 8,000 people like they were old friends gathered in her living room. She told stories about recording I Will Always Love You, about her daughter Bobby Christina, about the journey that had brought her to this moment in Sofia, Bulgaria, of all places. When she attempted I Will Always Love You, the song that had defined her legacy, everyone knew it would be different. Whitney couldn't hit the soaring high notes that had made the song legendary. Instead, she sang it in a lower register, her voice rough and weathered but somehow more honest than it had ever been. The arena became a choir of 8,000 broken hearts. As Whitney struggled through the final chorus, her voice giving out completely on the last note, the crowd took over. All 8,000 people finished the song for her, their voices creating a wall of love that held Whitney up when her own strength failed. She stood at the microphone with tears streaming down her face, listening to thousands of strangers sing the song that had made her immortal. In that moment, Whitney Houston realized something that would sustain her through her final months. Her voice lived on in the hearts of everyone she had touched. But what nobody in that arena knew was that they had just attended Whitney Houston's funeral, 257 days early. When the final note faded and Whitney waved goodbye to Sofia, she was saying goodbye to more than just Bulgaria. She was saying goodbye to performing, to the stage that had been her home for 30 years, to the part of herself that had defined her entire existence. Backstage, Whitney collapsed the moment she was out of public view. The effort of performing for 90 minutes with destroyed vocal cords had left her physically and emotionally shattered. Patricia found her sitting on the dressing room floor, still in her stage gown, staring at nothing. "I can't do this anymore, Pat," Whitney whispered. "I'm not fooling anyone, least of all myself." It was the first time Whitney had spoken the truth out loud. The voice was gone, and with it the identity she had built her entire life around. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within hours, video clips of Whitney's vocal failures were spreading across the internet. International music critics called the performance painful to witness and the tragic end of a legend. The headlines were brutal. Whitney's voice dies in Sofia, the night the music died, America's sweetheart's heartbreaking goodbye. But the 8,000 people who had actually been in that arena told a different story. Social media exploded with testimonials from fans who had witnessed something they called sacred. They spoke not of vocal failure, but of courage, not of a broken voice, but of an unbroken spirit. "Whitney gave us everything she had left," wrote Mariana Popov, a Bulgarian fan who had been in the front row. "When she couldn't sing anymore, she gave us her heart. When her voice failed, her soul took over. I've never experienced anything more beautiful in my life." The reviews from people who were actually there painted a completely different picture than the critics who watched videos. "She showed us what real bravery looks like," posted Dmitry Petrov from Sofia. When everything that made her famous was gone, Whitney Houston was still Whitney Houston. "She taught us that love is stronger than perfection." Within days, the hashtag #Sofia remembers Whitney was trending across Eastern Europe. Fans shared videos not of her vocal struggles, but of the moments when 8,000 people sang together, creating something more beautiful than any solo performance could have been. Whitney herself read these posts from her hotel room in Los Angeles, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, she felt something other than shame about her voice. 257 days later, Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. When the news broke on February 11, 2012, the 8,000 people who had been in Sofia felt a unique connection to Whitney's final chapter. They had been present for her last goodbye, even though none of them, including Whitney, had known it at the time. The tributes poured in from Bulgaria. The Armeets Arena held a special memorial service. Fans gathered at the exact spot where Whitney had sat on the stage edge and shared her heart with them. Flowers, photos, and handwritten letters in dozens of languages created a shrine to the woman who had given them her last performance. "We were the last people to hear Whitney Houston sing," said Elena Vasquez, who had driven 12 hours from Romania to attend the concert. "But more importantly, we were the last people to see her find peace with who she was beyond her voice." The true legacy of that night in Sofia wasn't about vocal failure, it was about human triumph. Whitney Houston had built her entire identity around supernatural vocal ability. When that was taken away, she discovered something more valuable: the capacity to connect with people as herself, not as an image of perfection. The 8,000 witnesses to Whitney's final performance carry a secret that the rest of the world will never fully understand. They saw beyond the headlines and the vocal analysis. They saw courage in its purest form, the decision to be vulnerable when everything inside you wants to hide. In losing her voice, Whitney Houston finally found herself. Music historians now recognize the Sofia concert as one of the most important performances in modern music history. Not because of what went right, but because of what went wrong and how it revealed the indestructible human spirit beneath the superstar facade. The recording equipment captured Whitney's vocal struggles that night, but it couldn't capture the love that filled that arena. It documented the failure of her instrument, but missed the triumph of her soul. Those 8,000 people became the keepers of Whitney's final gift to the world, proof that authenticity is more powerful than perfection, that vulnerability is stronger than invincibility, and that love can transform even our most broken moments into something beautiful. Whitney Houston died 257 days later, but her voice lives forever in the hearts of 8,000 strangers who became her final choir. On February 11, 2012, when the news broke that Whitney was gone, the people of Sofia didn't just mourn a celebrity. They mourned a friend who had trusted them with her most vulnerable moment and received their love in return. The woman who had spent 30 years trying to be perfect for everyone had finally learned, in a Bulgarian arena with broken vocal cords and 8,000 forgiving hearts, that she had always been enough exactly as she was. The voice was gone, but Whitney Houston, the real Whitney Houston, had never been more alive.